Okay, so we're going to look at the spinal nerves now. And so this is showing you an example similar to what we saw in the muscle. So before in the muscle, we had like bone and tendon to muscle down to the smallest components. Well, here we're seeing the same thing with a spinal nerve. So we have the spinal cord. Here's our white matter or gray matter. Here's our anterior and posterior horns. There's our lateral horn, our gray commissure, our anterior median fissure. So here are the rootlets that come out. They form an anterior and a posterior root, which is what we see over here. Okay, so here is the spinal cord. Here is the anterior root. Here is the posterior root. The posterior root has this little bulb on it. That's called the posterior root ganglion. Now, from here we have the spinal nerve, and that's what we see here. So here's that ganglion, that bulb, okay? And so we have anterior, posterior root, spinal nerve, and then the spinal nerve splits again. So we have the anterior and posterior root that come together to make the spinal nerve, and then the spinal nerve splits again, and it makes into a ramus, an anterior and a posterior ramus. So it goes from a root to a ramus. Now the posterior ramus goes to the posterior structures, which there's not many from the spinal cord, right? So it's pretty small. The anterior ramus is the larger, and it goes more towards the anterior of the body. So those are the two main branches. Now notice here we have a meningeal branch. So this goes to the meninges. So this innervates the tissue around the spinal cord. Then we have a communicating rami, and then here's our sympathetic ganglion. So notice and learn rootlets to the anterior and posterior root, the posterior root having the posterior ganglion, to the spinal nerve, which then branches into the posterior ramus, which is the smaller, and the anterior ramus, which is the larger. So that is the general characteristics that we want you to see. So here we have our posterior ramus, our anterior ramus, and the meningeal branch. Now, depending on where we are, so the meningeal branch, as we said, it re-enters the vertebral canal and innervates the meninges, the vertebrae, and those spinal ligaments. The posterior ramus innervates the muscles and joints in the region of the spine and the skin of the back. So the posterior goes posterior. And the anterior is the larger. It innervates the anterior and lateral skin and muscles of the trunk, and it gives rise to the nerves of the limbs. Now, we said in different regions it does different things. So in the region of the trunk, or the thoracic region, it forms an intercostal nerve, and that travels along the inside of the ribs. Okay, so we talked earlier about how there's the endoneurium, which is right around the individual nerve fibers. Perineurium is around a bundle, and epineurium is around the large bundle. We talked about how there's afferent and efferent. Somatic is going to go to skin, skeletal muscles, bones, and joints. Visceral is going to go to glands, the heart, and smooth muscle. So we have the different spinal nerves. So there's 31 pairs. 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. So we just looked through these two diagrams. This is showing a close-up of what we have happening here. So here's our anterior root, our posterior root. So this is a motor pathway, which means movement, and then we have a sensory pathway. So here's the ganglion. This is the spinal nerve. So that means that we have the ramus is going to be splitting shortly after here. The posterior root ganglion, this is just a collection of cell bodies, nerve cell bodies. Now a plexus is just a collection where nerves come together, and from these we get a different collection of nerve fibers that are traveling to similar areas. And so the plexuses, as we see here, we have the cervical plexus, and so this receives fibers from the anterior rami of nerves C1 through C5, and then it gives us some specific nerves. So one of the most important is our phrenic nerve. So you can see how these nerves are coming from the vertebrae. They come together, they can converge or diverge, right? And so we have the phrenic nerve, which we can see as part of C5. Here we've got part of C3, part of C4. Okay, so the phrenic nerve is a collection of nerves. And why is that important? Because it goes to our diaphragm. And then when we talk about nerves that go to the head, here we have the lesser occipital and great auricular. Now it makes sense that it goes to the ear region, okay? So some of these have names that make sense. The brachial plexus. Brachial plexus is one that we talk about a lot. You will need to know. So this is cervical nerves 5, 6, 7, 8, and T1. And they make the arms that go down, or the nerves that go down your arm. So you have the musculocutaneous, the axillary, the radial, the median, and ulnar. And how do you remember those names? You remember MARMU, M-A-R-M-U, musculocutaneous, axillary, radial, median, and ulnar. And so you can see the different regions. So here we have trunks, roots, anterior divisions, posterior divisions, and cords. And this is showing you how those nerves innervate the hand. So the radial nerve, part of the thumb, part of the back of the hand. Ulnar nerve, little finger side. Yellow is median. looking here in our slides, just a short review of what afferent or sensory neurons and efferent motor neurons are located and their pathways. So we have the afferent sensory into the posterior horns. That's the gray matter. Into the posterior dorsal root, axons of the sensory neurons. We have the posterior root ganglion, which are the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. The commissure, and we have the posterior columns and lateral columns that carry axons up to the brain. So these are the afferent sensory neuron important structures. Efferent, we have the anterior horns. These are going to be the cell bodies of motor neurons. The anterior ventral roots, axons of the symptomatic neurons. The lateral horns, autonomic motor neurons. And the lateral and anterior columns carry axons from neurons in the brain to the motor neurons. So this is a summary of the nerve plexuses. So we've talked about cervical, we've talked about brachial, and these are those bundles of nerves that come out of the spine. They are spinal nerves that come together and they converge in these plexuses, and then they make specific nerves. The important one from the cervical plexus we talked about was the phrenic nerve. And in the brachial plexus, we have MARMU, musculocutaneous, axillary, radial, median, and ulnar nerves, and their distribution down the arm and hand. Then we have the lumbar plexus, and the lumbar plexus is the next one we have that we look at. So this is where our femoral nerve is going to originate from. This is from the lumbar plexus. And I went too far. So here we have the same diagram. So the femoral nerve, you can see it here, and it's part of this collection of nerves and how they're all coming together. And you can see the femoral nerve here and how it is from a specific group. And lastly, we have the sacral plexus. This is the sacral coccygeal plexus. And the key nerves that we have here are the tibial and the fibular nerve. They are the nerves that are just distal to the sciatic nerve. And so you can see the sciatic nerve here, and the sciatic nerve branches into the tibial nerve and the fibular nerve. And so it's the sciatic nerve for majority of the thigh, and then it branches off. The other nerve that is in this deep plexus is the pudendal nerve. This is the nerve that is for the majority of the genitalia. We do have some from the lumbar plexus, which are the ilioinguinal and the genitofemoral, and they also play a role in some of the genitalia. The plexuses, again, these are collections of nerves, and when we look at nerve distribution, we talk about dermatomes. And so a dermatome, this one's just a little bit bigger to see, but each spinal nerve provides sensory input from a specific area of skin called a dermatome. And so this is just the larger map, and so it is the diagram of the cutaneous region, And this allows us to determine at what level a spinal nerve has been damaged. And so if we're looking at cranial nerve 2, 3, 4, the hand especially is very important when we look at the distribution of numbness that can occur. If someone's having a neck injury and they're having numbness that is on one side of the hand or the other, more medial or lateral. The trunk kind of goes along with the thoracic nerves. And then the lower legs are, or the legs start at lumbar. It gets to be sacral down on the lower outside of the leg, and then again the genitalia. So this is a dermatome map. Be very good to learn and know the dermatome map. These are some clinical problems that develop related to nerves. We've talked about paraplegia, quadriplegia, hemiplegia. Spinal shock it has a condition of paralysis, and so there are different ideas as far as how exactly when this occurs. We talked about spina bifida, how that's a neural tube problem, and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. We talked about ALS in class. Reflexes, we talked about just briefly. Reflexes are a quick involuntary movement. We don't think about, like when the doctor hits you on the knee, that is a reflex. And so what happens is you have sensory information that goes to the spinal cord, and it immediately synapses with a motor neuron that tells a muscle, ooh, we need to move. And so this is just testing the pathway of those specific motor neurons. So it gives you sensory and motor. And this is what we call monosynaptic. There's just a single synapse in this process. We have visceral reflexes, which are part of the autonomic nervous system that we really don't have any control over. And then we have somatic reflexes. Somatic reflexes, there are different types. So we have reflexes that are based off of receptors, afferent nerves. We have an integrating center. We have an efferent nerve, and then a skeletal muscle. And so what this is saying is our body has mechanisms built in that it can detect a problem. It sends a signal to a part of the body that monitors and measures what is normal. If it's outside of normal, it sends a signal to, in this case, a muscle in order to carry out a response. So we talked about a monosynaptic reflex, and these are the different types of reflexes. So stretch reflex, just like it sounds. Okay, that's what the knee jerk is. When the doctor hits you on the knee, it stretches part of the muscle tendon faster than what we would normally expect. And so that's the body's way of protecting the knee by straightening it, because the signal is, ooh, I got stretched too fast. I need to make a movement change to protect that muscle. Flexor reflex is when you withdraw from something, getting burned. Cross reflex, for example, is if you step on something with one foot, you draw that leg up, but your other leg it stiffens in order to help make sure you don't fall. And so I think that's the summary in our notes here as well. That is kind of the overview that we needed to go through for this chapter. If you have any questions, make sure you bring them up in class, and we will do our review portion here.